Hello, this is the Principles of Government Section A lecture. Our prioritized standard is Government Civics 1. Objectively, we're going to analyze the European influences on the Founding Fathers. The passage of the Stamp Act of 1765 that created a new tax for American colonists proved to create the spark leading to American independence from Britain. Now, the decision to separate from Britain and create the United States was not merely about taxes, but rather about how the idea that citizens have certain rights and those rights were not actually being honored. Kind of this idea that there's no taxation without representation was one of the major issues at that time. Many of the leaders of the American Revolution believed in the concept of natural rights. And natural rights is the idea that individuals possess certain rights that cannot be taken away, things that are inherent and unalienable, meaning rights you are born with and given by God. This concept of natural rights was refined and popularized in the years leading up to the Revolution with the help of English philosopher John Locke. Locke argued that all humans possess the natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Now, if you thought I was going to say pursuit of happiness, Thomas Jefferson in a lot of ways copied John Locke, although he did change property to pursuit of happiness at the urging of Benjamin Franklin. The more you know. Locke and other natural rights philosophers said the purpose of government is to protect natural rights. English philosopher Thomas Hobbes and other philosophers like him theorized that people entered into a social contract where people surrendered, either willingly or possibly through inaction, some natural rights in exchange for government protection. Locke's work actually built off of Hobbes' work. This origin of the term social contract can actually be found in writings all the way back to Plato. Additionally, this idea, this concept of a social contract, you can trace this back to ancient times, like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, possibly even the biblical idea of the covenant between God and humans. Genevan philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau suggested that government was based on the idea of popular sovereignty. And by popular sovereignty, this means people should determine for themselves the nature of their government. Now, Rousseau claimed democracy was best suited at achieving this. So, the modern idea of democracy saw its roots in ancient Greece and also ancient Rome. Ancient Greece created a direct democracy where citizens made decisions through majority rule. If you're curious, the word democracy actually comes from two different Greek words. One, demos, which means people, and rule, or kratos, which means rule. So basically, when you see democracy, that means people rule. If you're curious with the Greek version of democracy, the direct democracy, participation was generally limited to adult male citizens. If you were a foreign resident, you couldn't participate. If you were a woman, you couldn't participate. If you were a slave, you could not participate. But all the men were capable of all deciding everything within the country. Ancient Rome created a republic, which is a representative democracy where people choose their representatives in the government. Due to what the Founding Fathers considered the abuses of power by King George III, many advocated instead for a separation of powers within the government, as advocated by French philosopher Charles-Louis Montesquieu. By a separation of powers, this means dividing government into legislative, executive, and judicial branches. So by dividing government control among multiple branches, it ensured that no one branch could actually become too powerful. Locke argued that since the right to govern comes from the consent of the people, the social contract was able to be dissolved if the obligation of securing natural rights was not fulfilled. Now, colonists suggested documents like the Magna Carta from 1215 and also the British Bill of Rights from 1689 guaranteed them certain rights. and they suggested that British actions violated the social contract, therefore allowing the colonists to dissolve the social contract. As American colonists increasingly protested British policies, think about things like the Boston Massacre and Boston Tea Party, a series of harsh penalties were enacted against the colonies, pleading colonists to unite. In Philadelphia in 1776, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee including Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, John Adams, and Robert Livingston to draft a statement of American independence. Now, if you're curious what the First Continental Congress did, they actually came together to call for a total boycott of British goods, so less high profile than the second. Drafted by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, 1776. It identified and focused on problems, grievances, aspirations, and principles that unified the colonial groups and forged a national identity. The Declaration borrowed heavily from natural rights philosophers, asserting that all men are created equal, and claiming that God had endowed on all people certain unalienable rights that could not be taken away by governments, particularly life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which I mentioned previously. In November 1777, the Continental Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, sometimes just called the Articles of Confederation, in 1781, when that was finally ratified, which was concerned primarily with limiting the powers of the central government, creating a government made solely of a legislative branch, which they called just Congress. Also, each state was equally represented, one vote per state regardless of the size, with no executive or judicial branches of the government. Congress also had a power to declare war, make peace, make treaties and alliances, coin or borrow money, and regulate trade with Native Americans. However, they could not levy taxes or regulate trade among states and had to rely on states for funding, which actually had no obligation to do so. With no executive branch carrying out of the laws, were actually left to the individual states, which commonly ignored laws passed by Congress. You have this government, only an executive branch, no executive branch, which basically makes it like a toothless tiger of a government. So to amend the Articles of Confederation, all states had to agree, which means that there were actually 0 amendments. So under the Articles of Confederation, England actually refused to negotiate with Congress and instead negotiated with each of the 13 states separately, and oftentimes they would pit the states against each other. In May of 1787, 55 delegates met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation, but soon abandoned this plan and opted to develop a brand new government. While successfully limiting government power, the Articles of Confederation also created a completely ineffective government. So learning from the failures of the Articles of Confederation, yet remembering why they rebelled, would actually guide the Constitutional Convention. All right, this concludes Principles of Government, Section A. Our prioritized standard again was Government Civics 1. Objectively, now you can analyze the European influences on the Founding Fathers.